The sun's rays broke through the clouds, illuminating the rows of tourists gathered at the guard post, a place that had become a symbol of strict discipline and unwavering order. The crowd was whispering animatedly, discussing the sights and anticipating the perfect shots for social media. However, there was something wrong with this clamor. The tension came on suddenly, like a gust of cold wind in the middle of a sweltering day. He was noticed at once. A man with an unceremonious smile and a loud voice made his way through the crowd as if it existed solely for his convenience. Tall, with expensive sunglasses and overconfidence, he looked like he was ready to grab not only attention, but all the space around him. His abrupt movements and dismissive tone made those around him uncomfortable. "What are we stopping here for?" he said loudly, blocking out the chatter around him. "What are we waiting for?" "To see these, what do you call them, guardians of tradition." His words were drenched in sarcasm. Someone tried to move away, but the crowd was too dense. The tourists, accustomed to politely ignoring such personalities, fell silent. The man's words seemed to awaken something dangerous in the air, creating an atmosphere in which everyone felt that this was not the end. The man continued, now addressing not only his companion, but also those who happened to be within the radius of his vocal attack. "I wonder if they do anything at all but stand still like furniture. And if you check to see how much stamina they have?" He hummed, and his companion tried to besiege him with a light touch of her hand on his elbow. But he only waved it away. The crowd finally saw the men he was talking about. At his post, as still as a statue, stood a blackguard. His uniform was impeccable, his gaze straight ahead, as if ignoring everything around him. It was as if the guard was carved out of granite, ignoring the bustle and noise. He was the one the tourist had chosen as his next target. The man took a step forward. The people around him tensed. The crowd's attention was now focused only on him and the motionless figure of the guard. There was a sense of something inevitable in the air. "Hey, you," came his voice, which seemed to cut through the tension around him. "Is that what you call this job? Just stand around here all day? It's exhausting, isn't it? Or do you even know what I'm saying?" The crowd froze. Some put their phones away to record what was happening. Others averted their eyes, not wanting to participate. The guardsman didn't even blink. His impeccable posture and complete calmness was like a challenge to the man. The tourist, however, felt it as a signal for further pressure. He continued to approach, his words growing louder and sharper. The tension in the air grew with every step, and the crowd, as if on edge, realized that something was about to happen that would be impossible to forget. The tourist stood a few steps away from the guard, examining him from head to toe, as if he were evaluating goods at a market. His grin grew wider and wider, his eyes glittering with gloating. The crowd, sensing the impending storm, watched in silence, some with alarm, some with morbid curiosity. "Wow," the man said loudly, blocking out the noise around him. "I thought they put people with intelligence in these positions, but apparently they recruit those who can just stand there, like—" He stopped, pausing to let the others catch the hint. "Like a piece of jewelry or a mannequin." The crowd began to whisper. A few people laughed nervously, either because of shock or in an attempt to lighten the mood. Others looked away, not wanting to be a part of what was happening, but the guardsman stood motionless, as if he had heard nothing. His figure, straightened in a perfectly clear stance, seemed to refuse to acknowledge the existence of insults. "Hey, you! I'm talking to you!" The tourist shouted louder, taking another step forward. His voice was imbued not only with arrogance, but also with the obvious pleasure of his own power over the situation. Do you even understand what I'm saying? Or do I need to explain it differently? Should I show you some pictures? The crowd froze. Some began to pull out their phones, recording what was happening. People's faces expressed a mixture of bewilderment and disgust, but no one intervened. Someone whispered to a neighbor, "He's overreacting." Zrania, but the words were drowned in a new wave of vocal pressure. "You know," the tourist continued, switching to a mocking tone, "you look as if you were put here just so that people could see. Look, people like you can be in uniform. Maybe they'll give you a medal for that. Oh, wait, you're probably used to other jobs. You know, taking out the trash, scrubbing floors. You must be a real pro at that, huh?" The crowd gasped. Some covered their mouths with their hands to hide their reactions. Some looked away, unable to bear what they saw. The tourist, catching this reaction, smiled wider. He was enjoying himself, enjoyed his power to humiliate, to bring to his knees not just a man, but a symbol of what he despised. "Look, at least smile when you're standing there, huh? Just once, show me you can do something other than—" He waved his hand, pointing at the motionless guard. "Or do you just stand there while the white men watch, huh? Your uniform is just a costume to make you look important. But in reality, you're nothing, right?" The guardsman did not move. His face remained impenetrable, like a mask. He didn't even seem to blink. But it was this silence that caused a strange sensation. Not weakness, but strength. The tourist, having gotten no reaction, seemed to feel irritated. He looked at the crowd, trying to find support. "Look at him? Seriously, doesn't he even realize what's going on here?" The man laughed loudly, leaning towards the nearest onlookers. "This isn't a guardsman anymore, it's just a background. A black background." He broke out into a rough laugh, adding gestures as if depicting a caricature. There was a stirring in the crowd. Someone clearly wanted to say something, but fear or reluctance to interfere kept them back. The tension reached its peak. People began to look not only at the tourist, but also at the guardsman, waiting for his reaction. Would he be able to hold out? Or would he break under this pressure after all? But the guardsman stood like a rock. His immobility seemed almost superhuman now. The tourist seemed to be beginning to feel that this man could not be broken so easily. But that only made him even more angry. "All right, let's see how long you can hold out, hero," he said, his voice lower and his eyes flashing cruelty. The crowd froze as if time stood still, waiting for the inevitable continuation. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened to you or your loved ones. It's important for us to know how such events resonate in the hearts of our viewers. If you're interested in following stories like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the most exciting stuff. And now, we continue. The guardsman continued to stand motionless, as if he had nothing to do with what was happening. His posture was perfect, his back straight, his shoulders square, his gaze fixed forward, invisible but unyielding. Even under the hail of humiliation he did not move, did not give the slightest sign of irritation. This silence, instead of being a sign of weakness, seemed to reinforce his presence. Everyone in the crowd realized that what stood before them was not just a man in uniform, but the embodiment of fortitude. The tourist, seeing that he was not getting the expected reaction, increased his pressure. His voice became louder, his movements sharper. He waved his arms as if trying to break this invisible shield of equanimity. "What are you? A robot? Or maybe you're too afraid to say anything," he shouted with obvious anger. "How long can you stand there like a wooden man? Are you forbidden to be emotional? Show me something." The crowd froze, holding its breath. The attention was now focused only on two figures, the guardsman and the tourist. People felt that something was about to happen, that the tension building up in the air was about to break out. But the guardsman did not move. His eyes, black and calm, remained fixed on an invisible point ahead. That gaze was a force in itself, so hard and impenetrable that even the tourist, despite his boorishness, began to look less confident. "You think you're in charge? You're nothing. Just a pawn," the man shouted, taking a sharp step forward to get closer to the guard. His hand flew up as if he was going to grab the man's shoulder. The crowd gasped. The people around them began to whisper louder. Someone picked up the phone to keep the moment going. But the moment the tourist was too close, the guardsman made the first seemingly insignificant movement. He turned his head slightly so that he could meet the aggressor's eyes. This simple gesture, so small yet filled with infinite power, caused the tourist to freeze. His hand remained in the air as if it had been frozen. The guardsman's eyes were calm but cold, as if carved from stone. There was no fear in them, no anger, only absolute certainty of his rightness and position. It was a look that said, "You can yell all you want, but you won't get anywhere." The crowd suddenly felt a change. The tension was no longer coming from the tourist. It was coming from the guardsman. His immobility no longer seemed a mere lack of reaction. It had become a weapon against rudeness, humiliation, and malice. The tourist seemed to sense this. His confidence began to crack. "Ah, so you can move." "Finally," he shouted, but his voice was no longer so loud. There was a note of doubt in it. "Come on, say something. Or is it your job just to stand there like a statue?" The guardsman remained silent, but now his silence pressed not only on the tourist, it was enveloping the whole crowd, making what was happening even more tense. It seemed that even the air around became thicker, harder to breathe. People around them began to turn away, as if they couldn't stand the heat any longer. Someone whispered to a neighbor, "Is it going to break?" But the guardsman didn't break. He stood like a wall, reflecting everything the tourist tried to throw at him. And this silence, this fortitude began to turn against the aggressor. Even those who had initially laughed at the tourist's words now looked at him differently. Looks of condemnation began to appear in the crowd. The tourist didn't notice it. His anger had turned to helplessness, but he did not yet realize his defeat. All he could do was shout, waving his arms as if hoping to break through an invisible wall. But that wall only grew stronger. The guardsman was as immovable as a stone statue that had survived the ages. No one in the crowd dared to utter a word. Everyone was watching, feeling that every moment brought the inevitable outcome closer. The tourist had made the final challenge, and now everything depended on what would happen next. The crowd, as if hypnotized, continued to watch. The tourist, unable to get the answer he wanted, hissed in irritation, his anger mixed with uncertainty. But instead of retreating, he took another step forward as if trying to pierce the guard's unwavering silence with his anger. "You're good." He grinned venomously, glancing around the guard as if looking for new targets to attack. "You're an example to the rest of us, aren't you? A black man in uniform standing guard. You think that makes you better than the others? You're nothing more than a puppet. You're just standing there because someone thought you'd fit in nicely." His voice became sharper, as if each word had sharp edges that could hurt. The tourist began to speak louder so that everyone around him could hear him. "I wonder how far you traveled to get that job. Or were you hired to show that even people like you can look important? It's all a play, and you're just a set in it." He laughed harshly and loudly. "You're still a nobody on the inside. All your life under other people's feet, eh? That's your nature." The crowd froze. Even the most indifferent onlookers, those who had been watching the scene indifferently up to that moment, could not hide their shock. A few people averted their eyes, as if not believing that someone could say such things openly and with such anger. But the tourist didn't notice it. He was too busy with his game, his show. He stepped even closer, almost right up to the guard. His voice was quieter, but that only made the words more humiliating. "You know I'm right," he whispered so that only the guardsman could hear. "You can wear the uniform. You can stand here all day, but you'll always be just dirt on our boots, dirt that can be wiped off. Nobody respects you. Nobody takes you seriously. You're nothing." With those words, he subtly jabbed a finger at the guardsman's chest. It was a provocative gesture, subtle but undeniably aggressive. The crowd gasped, as if that slight poke were a thunderclap in the midst of a silent thunderstorm. The tension had reached a climax. People were waiting for a response, whether verbal or physical. The guardsman, however, remained in the same position. His gaze did not waver. He continued to stare straight ahead, as if the tourist were just part of the noisy background. But there was such power in that stillness, in that silence, that even those who did not know him personally began to feel respect for him. The tourist, not noticing that he was losing control of the situation, continued his performance. He raised his voice again, addressing the crowd, now with a challenge. "Do you see what he's like? He won't even answer. You know why? Because he knows his place. Because he realizes that if he opens his mouth, he'll only confirm that I'm right. People like him are not worthy of respect. They're just—" He didn't have time to finish. Someone in the crowd shouted loudly, "Enough!" This voice, though not specifically addressed to the tourist, split the tension like lightning. The tourist turned around, trying to see where the resistance was coming from, but the faces around him were covered with masks of disapproval and condemnation. However, he did not back down. His anger, fueled by the realization that he was losing control of the crowd, again erupted into insults. "Ah, are you all so sensitive?" He threw into the crowd, then turned back to the guardsman. "Are you going to stand there like a piece of furniture? Is that the best you can do?" But this time his words did not have the same effect. People were no longer laughing, no longer making videos with such enthusiasm. The tourist was beginning to lose his audience, but he was blinded by his own anger, and the guardsman stood, silent, without flinching, and this silence became louder than any tourist's shouts. The crowd sensed something big was ahead, the silence before the storm. The crowd seemed to freeze, absorbed in what was happening. Laughter, whispers, and quiet comments disappeared. There was a silence so thick that even the sound of footsteps in the distance seemed louder. Everyone who witnessed the scene held their phones in their hands or just watched, but no one moved, no one dared to intervene. The tourist, noticing this sudden vacuum of sounds, took it as a confirmation of his power. He looked back at the onlookers, smirked, as if enjoying their silence, and turned back to the guard. His tone became even more contemptuous, his words even harsher. "Look at him," he threw loudly, pointing his finger at the motionless figure of the guard. "Do you see it? This is what emptiness means. This is what it means to be nothing. Even when you're humiliated in front of dozens of people, you just stand there, like a dog that's been trained not to bark. His words stabbed into the air like sharp needles, splitting the atmosphere around him. People couldn't look away, as if trapped by the tension. Someone clearly wanted to say something, but fear or unwillingness to become the next target restrained everyone. "Do you think your silence makes you strong?" The tourist continued, his voice now rumbling like thunder in the void. "No, it makes you weak. You're standing here because you have no choice, because people like you are always used. They put you in positions to make you seem important. But really, you're just—" He paused, as if savoring the moment. "Just trash." Some in the crowd shuddered. Someone involuntarily gave an awkward cough, trying to shake off the weight of this oppressive environment. But no one dared to answer the tourist. Even those who were already clearly disgusted by his words preferred to avert their eyes or hide behind the screens of their phones. Now, most of them were taking videos, not for fun, as in the beginning, but because of the feeling that they were witnessing something that would go beyond this place. The guardsman continued to stand, motionless and silent. His gaze remained fixed forward, as if the tourist did not exist. But this immobility was no longer perceived by the crowd as weakness. People began to feel that behind this silence there was something grandiose, that this man was not letting himself be broken. "Why don't you say anything?" the tourist shouted, already losing control of his tone. His anger was beginning to turn into something more, almost hysterical. "Are you afraid? You think that makes you strong? No, you're just a coward, just like the rest of you." He looked around at the people around him, as if he was trying to draw the entire crowd into his performance. "And you all keep quiet," he shouted not only to the guardsmen, but also to the audience. "Why? Do you all enjoy watching this hero endure? None of you will tell him that he is useless? Or are you afraid too?" There was movement in the crowd again. Some took a step back. Others tried to hide their faces. Everything was written on their faces. Shame at what was happening, fear of the tourists' aggression, and embarrassment at their own inaction. No one knew what to do. The tourist sensed this fear, this passivity, and turned to the guard again. His voice became low and cold, like poison. "You're letting them all down. Do you understand? Every time you don't speak, you show them you're nothing. They look at you and all they see is weakness. There's nothing you can do. You never will." Someone in the crowd exhaled sharply, unable to bear the strain, but the guardsman remained as he was. His silence grew louder and louder, drowning out the shouts of the tourist. People were beginning to feel it. Even in this moment of humiliation, the guardsman was stronger. Now everyone wasn't looking at the tourist, everyone was looking at the guardsman. And in this silent battle, it was clear that the denouement was near. The silence of the crowd was a sign. They were waiting for something more, something that would change everything. The tourist, intoxicated by his superiority and the silence around him, no longer noticed that his words were beginning to lose power. His voice, though loud, no longer filled the air as it had in the beginning. It now sounded like an echo of his own anger turned to emptiness. But the guardsman still stood, and this standing, this steadfastness, began to give the spectators a strange feeling. It seemed that something was about to happen, that the silence was about to end. "I'm talking to you," the tourist shouted, his face contorted with irritation. He moved closer again, so close that there were only a few centimeters between him and the guard. "What? Did you swallow your tongue? Or is it your job just to be a silent stage set? Come on, say something. Or are you so used to being humiliated that you don't care anymore?" The crowd froze. The tension had reached its peak. Every eye was now fixed on the guardsman. Some spectators even stopped filming, forgetting their phones in an attempt to catch every detail. It seemed as if the air itself had become thick as water, and there was something unbearably heavy in that crushing silence. Suddenly, the guardsman moved. It was a barely perceptible movement. He turned his head smoothly, slowly, with the precision of a pendulum. The eyes, which until that moment had been staring through the tourist into the void, were now fixed directly on him. That gaze was full of cold, meaningful power, and it silenced the tourist. All his eloquence, all his rage, seemed to evaporate in an instant. "You," the tourist began, but the words stuck in his throat. His voice sounded quieter than he wanted it to, almost like a whisper. The guardsman, still maintaining absolute calm, raised his hand. The movement was so smooth and controlled that it seemed unreal. He slowly extended his palm and pointed his finger at the ground near the tourist's feet. The gesture was simple, but it had a clear and unambiguous message. "You have crossed the border. Go back." The crowd gasped. It was the first time the guardsman had done anything, the first time he had broken his silent steadfastness, and the gesture, despite his restraint, seemed like a thunderous boom. People looked at the guardsman with admiration and wonder. In one movement, he said more than a tourist could express in hundreds of words. "What are you doing?" the tourist shouted, now with a noticeable tremor in his voice. "You think you can tell me what to do? You have no right." But his words sounded uncertain. He himself sensed that something had changed. The guardsman continued to stare at him without saying a word, but the gaze was no longer just calm. There was determination in it, and that determination, that certainty, began to weigh on the tourist more heavily than any words could. The crowd stood in absolute silence. No one moved, no one spoke, everyone waited to see what would happen next. But the guardsman was not going to add anything more. He had already made his statement, and that was enough. The tourist took a step back. The movement was barely noticeable, but it was an obvious sign to everyone present that he had backed away. His face still expressed anger, but now there was something else in his eyes. Fear. "Okay," he said through gritted teeth, trying to keep his dignity intact. "You're worthless anyway. You'll never amount to anything. You'll always just stand there while the others live." But even those words no longer had the power they once had. Now it was just a set of sounds that drowned in the silence created by the guard. The crowd was no longer looking at the tourist. All eyes were fixed on the guardsman. His simple, calibrated movement had transformed him from an object of humiliation into a figure of admiration. When the tourist finally retreated, the guard slowly returned to his original position. His head turned forward again, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the distance, as if nothing had happened. He was once again a symbol of unwavering steadfastness. But now everyone understood. It was not just a form, not just silence. It was a power that could not be broken. The crowd exhaled at once, and in that exhalation the common conclusion was that the humiliation was over. Let's take another short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you or your loved ones have experienced similar situations. It's important for us to know how such moments resonate with our viewers. If you like our story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. The silence that fell over the crowd after the guardsman's gesture lasted a fraction of a second, but it seemed like an eternity. The tourist, until that moment furious and self-assured, suddenly found himself the center of attention in a way he didn't want. His face was frozen in a mixture of bewilderment and anger, but the cracks behind that mask were already showing. He stared at the guardsman as if hoping to find something in his gaze that could be used as an excuse for his rage. But there was only calm hardness there. "What? You're all quiet?" He turned to the crowd, challenging all those gathered. His voice had been loud, but now there was a note of desperation in it. "Are you taking his side? He's not even doing anything. He's just standing there like... He faltered. The words that had come so easily out of his mouth now lost their power. The crowd, instead of supporting him, or at least remaining neutral, began to whisper. The whispers grew louder and louder, closing in on him like an inexorable sentence. "That's just disgusting," someone in the middle of the crowd said loudly. The voice was full of contempt. "Humiliating a man just because he's doing his job? This is too much," added the other. "What a shame." The tourist looked back at the men talking, his face even more tense. He tried to maintain his dignity, but his eyes showed fear. He realized that he had lost control of the situation. The crowd he had earlier tried to involve in his humiliating performance was now judging him. "You all don't understand anything," he shouted, clearly trying to regain his superiority. "This guy, he's just standing there. He doesn't even answer. What, are you saying he's better than me?" But his words no longer mattered. The people were no longer listening to him. They were looking at the guardsman who, despite everything that had just happened, stood as confidently as he had at the beginning. And in that confidence was a lesson for everyone. Someone in the crowd began filming the tourist, and it was not a gesture of curiosity but an act of judgment. The cameras were now pointed at him, not at the guardsman. The tourist realized this, and a realization dawned on his face. He was no longer the hero of his own performance. He had become an object of contempt. "Stop filming," he shouted, rushing to the nearest man with a phone. "Put that away. Don't you realize that he's—" "No, you don't understand," came a woman's voice from somewhere nearby. Her tone was cold and stern. "Look at you. You humiliate a man just because you don't like his skin color or his job. He's not the one dishonoring himself. It's you." The words cut through the remnants of his confidence. He froze, turned around, but couldn't find anything to say. There were looks of disapproval all around him, and those looks were more eloquent than any words. The crowd was no longer a silent witness. The whispers turned into loud discussions. Some even began to applaud the guard for his stamina. The tourist, on the other hand, stood in the middle of this scene, as if thrown into the center of the arena. His face was twisted, but not with rage, but with impotent anger and shame. "All right," he finally said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "You're all just stupid. He's just... He couldn't finish. His words sounded like a pathetic excuse, devoid of meaning. He looked around as if searching for a way out, but there were no more exits. People were staring at him, and in those looks he saw a reflection of his failure. Finally, he turned abruptly and hurried away, pushing his way through the crowd. People parted before him, but their eyes continued to follow him. Some filmed his departure, and others shouted phrases of condemnation. "Go on, you disgraceful bastard. Serves you right." When the tourist disappeared from sight, the crowd turned its attention back to the guard. And then something that no one had expected began. Applause broke out. They were sparse at first, as if people weren't sure if it was appropriate, but soon grew into a loud and sincere flurry of support. The guardsman did not change his posture. He didn't smile, didn't look up, didn't show an ounce of emotion. But his figure, his steadfastness, was now seen as a symbol. The tourist walked away in disgrace. But this moment will remain in everyone's memory, as a lesson that true strength is not in loud words, but in silent firmness and dignity. The tourist walked the tightrope of his own rage and self-confidence, but every step he took on that rope caused cracks in his image. His words, full of contempt and humiliation, no longer had power. They had become empty and meaningless, like echoes echoing in an empty hall. Until a few minutes ago, he had been enjoying the attention, feeling himself the lord of the situation. But now the atmosphere had changed. The people around him looked at him not with interest, but with judgment. Every glance, every whisper was like an invisible lash that left painful marks on his pride. He tried to resist this change, but the force of the crowd was inexorable. Every movement he made, every word he uttered, only made him fall harder. The tourist looked around again and again, trying to catch a single look of support, a single sign that someone understood him. But all he saw were cold, contemptuous faces that made his throat constrict more and more. "You don't understand anything," he shouted in desperation, addressing everyone and no one at once. His voice sounded uncertain, and his words were shaky, as if he didn't believe what he was saying. It's just a game. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just a joke." But no one laughed. The crowd remained silent, and then there were muffled phrases that made him feel the heat come over his face. A joke? Is that what he calls a joke? Humiliating a man for fun? Isn't he ashamed of himself? The words were quiet, but to the tourist they sounded like thunder. He turned to the guardsman again as if he hoped that he would somehow save him. But the guard remained motionless as before, his eyes fixed on the distance, as if the man before him did not exist. This disregard, absolute, total, annihilating, was stronger for the tourist than any words. It said, "You are nothing. Your words are nothing. You're not worth even a second of my attention." And that realization finally broke him. He took a step back, stumbling awkwardly. The crowd noticed it, and there was a sort of collective condemnation in the air. Someone laughed loudly, not at the guardsman, but at the tourist himself. This laughter swept through the crowd, catching more and more people with it. The tourist realized his laughable attempt at dominance had become a farce. He was now a laughingstock. "Do you think it's funny?" he shouted again, but his voice trembled. "You're all just hypocrites. You're just like him, all of you." But his words came across silence again. No one answered, no one tried to make excuses. This was his battle, and he had lost it. The tourist began to fumble with his gaze, looking for ways to escape, but his face gave everything away. He was no longer a confident man who could loudly assert his superiority. His face, flushed, his temples glistening with sweat, became a symbol of defeat. The crowd didn't look away. It stared at him as if he were something dirty that could no longer be hidden. This silent judgment was far worse than shouting or verbal condemnation. The tourist could feel each look burning him from the inside out, scorching away the remnants of his self-confidence. He took another step back, stumbling now. His shoulders slumped and his hands clenched into fists, but not to attack, but to hide his trembling. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. All he could do was stand at attention, drowning in his own helplessness. "That's enough," he said, but no one was listening. His voice was drowned in the hum of the crowd, which was getting louder and louder as they discussed what was happening. "I'm out of here. That's what you all want, isn't it?" He tried to pretend to walk away with his head held proudly high, but it was impossible. His back gave out in a crouch, and his steps were uncertain. The crowd parted in front of him, not out of respect, but to avoid being close to someone who was the epitome of humiliation. The cameras were still rolling, phones still raised, recording his every move. When he was finally outside the crowd, he stopped for a moment and looked back. He wanted to cast one last glance, to try to regain control. But all he saw was the figure of a guardsman, standing as still as he had at the beginning. The man didn't even turn his head in his direction. To him, the tourist was nothing anymore, only a memory. The tourist turned away, gritting his teeth. He knew. This memory would stay with him forever. Not his triumph, but his defeat. The tourist walked away, hunched over, crushed by the weight of his own defeat. His steps grew faster and faster, but even from a distance he could not shake the feeling that everyone was still watching him. The crowd parted, giving him way, but the movement was not a show of sympathy or respect. People stepped back to avoid touching him, as if he were the embodiment of something ugly, something they didn't want to see but couldn't take their eyes off. Each step he took was louder than he expected, echoing in the silent condemnation of those around him. The cameras continued to record his shame, and that knowledge drove him forward. He didn't look back again, though the urge to look at the crowd was almost unbearable. He knew what he would see: eyes full of contempt, faces with judgment written all over them, but most of all, he was afraid of meeting again with the one who, without even a word, had destroyed all his self-respect. In the meantime, the crowd, as if it were a single organism, focused its attention back on the guardsman. The one who had been the target of anger and humiliation stood as before, erect, collected, unwavering. His uniform fit impeccably, and his gaze, staring into the distance, seemed above everything that was going on. He did not make the slightest movement, did not give the slightest sign that he realized the magnitude of his triumph. But it was this silence, this absence of any response, that was his greatest answer. To those who watched this moment, the guardian's silence spoke louder than any words. There was a strength in him that was hard to describe, the strength of dignity, of fortitude, of self-control. His immobility, his calmness became a symbol of the fact that true professionalism is not only the ability to act, but also the ability not to give in to provocation, remaining above petty malice. "What a man!" whispered someone in the crowd, but his words were heard by many. "He didn't even look at him." "It's unbelievable," another voice added, louder. "I wouldn't have been able to take it." But he didn't even flinch. The guardsman, standing just as he had a few minutes ago, became an example to many. His steadfastness, his silence made the crowd realize that strength is not in shouting, not in trying to prove something to someone. Strength is the ability to maintain your dignity, even when they try to destroy you. It was this realization that filled the space around them. Everyone in the crowd, from those who had laughed at the beginning to those who were filming on their phones, now felt something new. It wasn't just condemnation of the tourist, it was respect for the man who had managed to stay above all the filth. The crowd began to disperse. People put their phones away, looked at each other, discussed what had happened. But even as they left, they looked back at the guard again and again. It seemed that now his motionless figure said more than a whole crowd of people could say. "I'll never forget it," said one woman, and her words, as if overheard in the air, echoed among those leaving. "That's a good lesson," the man next to her agreed. "Personally, I've learned not to throw words around. Some things are better said with silence, but this realization didn't come easy for everyone. Those who had laughed with the tourist now felt the shame that seemed to be absorbed into their faces. They avoided meeting each other's eyes, hid their phones, tried to be inconspicuous. They realized that their silence in the beginning was as much a weakness as the tourist's hysteria. The guardsman continued to stand. Time had no meaning to him. He was part of something bigger than his own feelings. He was someone who defended not only order, but dignity itself. His silence became a symbol of strength that many of those who looked up to him had yet to learn. In the distance, the figure of the tourist could still be seen, walking away with quick, uneven steps, as if running away from his own reflection. His face was no longer visible, but the people in the crowd knew that his expression would never be forgotten. It had become a symbol of defeat. Not physical defeat, but moral defeat. This was a man who had lost, not because he was weak, but because his anger and hatred had not resonated. As the last spectators began to disperse, leaving the guardsman's post behind, there was a silence in the air. It was not a pressurizing silence, but a cleansing silence. A silence that was more than just silence. It was the silence of a lesson that everyone took with them. A lesson that true strength lies in calm, that respect cannot be shouted, but can be earned. And at the center of it all remained the guardsman, unwavering, silent, the epitome of professionalism and dignity. The tourist's last words, spoken more to himself than to anyone else, dissolved into the humming air, leaving behind a heavy silence. The crowd, as if with a single breath, exhaled at once, but its attention was still fixed on two figures: the departing tourist's back and the motionless guard. Everyone who was present at that moment felt like a participant in something more than a simple street scene. The tourist, who at first had seemed so loud, so confident of his superiority, now looked broken. His shoulders were slumped, his steps were uneven, and his face could no longer be seen behind his back turned to the crowd. But everyone knew. His face expressed defeat. It wasn't just a failure, it was a collapse. His attempt to humiliate another man by using the power of words had resulted in his becoming an object of contempt. People began to move away, making way, but they did not do so out of politeness. Every step, every movement reflected the unwritten rule of the crowd. You've lost your right to be here. Their gazes, heavy and sharp, followed the tourist until he disappeared from sight. Everyone who looked after him felt a strange combination of anger, shame, and perhaps slight relief. His departure seemed inevitable, but still unpleasant to those who saw how far a man could go in his anger. But the protagonist of the moment remained where he was. The blackguard, whose silence was louder than the shouts and insults, was as still as a statue. He did not even make an attempt to follow the departing tourist with his gaze. His stance, his gaze forward, told everyone, "I am above this. I remain true to myself." To those who looked at him, it was a true symbol of strength. The crowd began to disperse, but not chaotically. Every step people took was accompanied by meaningful glances in the direction of the guardsman. Some were whispering, discussing what had happened. Others were taking the last shots to share the story, but no one passed by indifferently. This man is a true professional, someone said, loud enough to be heard. A true example, another voice echoed. If I were him, I wouldn't hold back. The words echoed in the heads of those who stood around him. People looked at the guardsman and saw in him something more than just a man in uniform. They saw in him the epitome of resilience, the ability to hold his own when everything around him was falling apart. They saw a man who didn't just stand up, he won without saying a single word. After a few minutes, the square began to empty. People were leaving, taking with them not just the images on their phones, but something more, a realization. Some walked in silence, digesting what was happening. Others discussed what they would have done in a similar situation. But there were no indifferent people left. Everyone took a piece of this lesson with them. Already, a couple of hours later, videos from the scene began to appear on social networks. The footage of a tourist yelling at a motionless guard and then walking away in shame instantly gained popularity. People left comments sharing their thoughts on what real strength means. Some admired the guardsman's stamina. Others condemned the tourist's behavior, but all agreed on one thing. It was a scene that will be remembered for a long time. This guard is an example to us all. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I could never have withstood such an onslaught. This man is a rock. The story took on a life of its own, spreading beyond the place where it happened. For many, it became a reason to reflect on their actions, their words, and their reactions to injustice. The guardsman himself remained true to himself. His shift was coming to an end, but he did not give himself the slightest liberty. He continued to stand as still as he had at the beginning, when no one could have predicted that an ordinary day on duty would turn into a lesson for all who witnessed the scene. His silence, his calmness, his dignity became not just his shield, but his sword. And with that sword, he won the battle without fighting. When evening came and the guardsman finally left his post, no one who saw him could pass by without respect. For those around him, he had become a symbol of fortitude, a lesson that sometimes the loudest words are the ones that go unspoken. A story that began as a humiliating scene ended in a triumph of human dignity, and everyone who witnessed that moment took with them not only a memory, but also a lesson they will never forget. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or your loved ones experienced racism in your life? We are very interested in your opinions and stories. We appreciate each and every one of you and thank you for spending time with us. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like if this story touched you. We wish you a wonderful day and only good events.